原定归给西有真见解，此心天巴浪给萨瓦如来巴通年白巴杜玛耶，归巴千波天巴金吉罗，连接你被大卫天上地，心头念哈当身是给你。念真滚度念波连贝罗，云前面巴给我金吉罗，路上要我去就不行。都去白去我真巴当，去为真苏真马心，看那领着记心长我了，我把天波你内你被错，这心长我能讲帮我当，给错他他主把这把拉，他就把当天把心给了，前面民众真的困给个，一点没容西北困所给，你没人呢这边的话了。对你全部给我经给了，能打381、381，真正是心没有全部以爱天别撒我所长巴拉，就把你把这把经给了。让你思索龙我之心都要买个着我不想的着我啊，同内着我周围归个位，将就三角就把经给了。身上给看出成囊松啦，恐怕没那将就迷住吧。来吧，真你给谁懂吧啦？怎么找不路吧？经给了。路被有来有往是这心，大灯了自信是吧？也心内拉动深度这为了嘛？有的给了给我经给了。土木浪山的个巴那，台巴跟个小个都是的，给谁给我就能当巴的，带来你的就发心给了，给谁我就能你就别洗，让他当谁东巴生活了。这么明白你把那个人，所当着的生活经给了。Tene güde nimbo rimniki, nenan shishin tonne sambayi, tunshi ne jo chole miye wara, tambe sushin juwa chungi lo. Lamsan tembe shenyen dan, sushin jube jonan shaten shin, shidan nangi bardu chebe so, nye wara shiwa jingi laptu so. Kyawa kundu yanda lama dan, jame chuki pela lanshu shingen, saran lamgi yenden razo nye, dorje shangi gopan yurto shu. Sange, chedan soge chonam la, chanchu bardu tani kya suchi, dagi chenye gibe sonam gi, drola bencher sange drubar shok. Sangye chedan soge chonam la, chanchu bardu tani kya suchi, dagi chenye gibe sonam gi, drola bencher sange drubar shok. Sangye chedan soge chonam la, chanchu bardu tani kya suchi, dagi chenye gibe sonam gi, drola bencher sange drubar shok. Saji bugi shushin me dojang, riva blinchin inde gembadi, sangye jindu mikte uargi, jogun nam dashin la jobar sho. Idam guru ratnam mandalakam niryatayam. Okay, so starting now today with the second chapter of Ayadeva's text, which is on the topic of suffering, truth of suffering, presented as an antidote to the mistaken belief that there is some kind of satisfactory form of existence in samsara. So then to introduce this in the handouts, I would like to read first a brief statement in a text, a commentary to one of the 5 Maitreya texts, the Madhyanta Vibhaga. The 4th chapter of the Madhyanta Vibhaga addresses, in part at least, the 37 practices that are conducive or that promote enlightenment. And so it starts with the 4, what I call the 4 closely placed recollections, and smriti upasthana. These 4 topics, these 4 meditation topics, these 4 practices are identified or described as the method to introduce yourself to the 4 Noble Truths, to gain an understanding of the 4 Noble Truths. This is in the first in the first verse from the 4th chapter of the Madhyanta Vibhaga. So the Madhyanta Vibhaga, the verses are considered to have been inspired by Maitreya. So they're called one of the 5 Maitreya teachings. And some of them, at least, have commentaries by Vasubandhu. This one does. And then there's also a sub-commentary by Stiramati. I like Stiramati because he glosses a lot of terms and sort of in a classic way. So it gives kind of what you might call authentic or authoritative interpretations of terms. So anyway, this is in. Do you have it?
No. Want me to get?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So this is in connection with the first verse, and it gives expression to this notion of the need to overcome attachment for samsara, and to do that by cultivating samsara's faults, and also reflecting on the good qualities or the advantages of nirvana. And so that idea sort of corresponds to the topic of renunciation. So if we can read it, the Tibetan and the English is there. It says, starts, because immature beings. So it says immature beings is kind of a euphemism for the original term, which really means like a child, literally a child, but in a spiritual sense. So someone who's not spiritually mature. So it says, Nyangele Deva Dam, Korwa Ni. So Nyangele Deva Nirvana, and Korwa is samsara. Korwa Niki, Yondenda Nieva, is there the good qualities of nirvana versus the defects of samsara through not realizing them. Matok Vecher. Then Duje Nam La Dewa Dan Sawan Dan Takwa Dan Datu Umbar Shembe. Then it says, then these immature beings mistakenly develop the idea of satisfactoriness. Dewa means sukha, that there's some kind of genuine form of well-being in samsara, that samsara has some kind of literally some kind of clean or pure or attractive quality to it, that there is some kind of then the opposite of impermanence, meaning that there's some kind of continuity of entities through time, and then the worst case is that they believe in a real self. And so because of these mistaken beliefs, then beings, these immature beings, develop a delight. Right? Did I say delight? So yeah, delight. They delight in the enjoyments or pleasures of samsara and samsara itself. That we cling to our samsaric existence itself. And then here, this is an interesting point, is to say that the idea of nirvana means they are frightened by nirvana. And that's an interesting phrase to kind of try to appreciate what the implications of that are. It suggests that when you first hear something about the nature of nirvana, the untutored person or the person who has a misguided understanding is actually going to be somewhat afraid, in some sense, of the idea of nirvana. And often that is interpreted to mean that if there is no self, so then nirvana is attained by eliminating the idea of a self. And so then the sense that whatever one thinks of as one's personal essence, that questioning its existence is something that is unsettling, and that people recoil from that and want to cling to that. It kind of reminds you of what is said even about the teaching on emptiness, which is that emptiness is so profound that some individuals, when they first hear about it, they might be frightened, and because of that fear at the implications of what they think emptiness means, then they will reject it. And so for that reason, in the case of emptiness in particular, it's not meant to be taught then without considering whether the persons to whom you might explain it are capable of hearing it, learning it, and accepting it for what it says. So anyway, this is somewhat reminiscent of that the person who is still very much attached to samsaric existence might react to the idea of nirvana as something that does not appeal to them. So that's an interesting thing to contemplate. Then it goes on and it says, so then it takes both of those things. So it says the understanding of the good qualities of nirvana and the faults of samsara, that understanding, and the lack of understanding and the tendency to be attached to the idea of samsara as being something enjoyable and that's something that you don't want to give up, then those two conditions can be overcome or can be reversed through seeing the truth. Seeing the truth means to seeing the Four Noble Truths. And therefore, then it says here, the final statement says, I just read the English. Meditation on the closely placed recollections, right, of which there are 4, is mentioned first, means first in the list of those 37 practices that are they represent a formulation of the overall path. In other words, there is a progression through those 37 practices that culminates with the attainment of arahatship. So the last group, in fact, are the Eightfold Noble Path, right? Which are cultivated at the level of an Arya. So these four closely placed recollections are practiced throughout one's spiritual development, but they also are practiced even by the beginning practitioner. And so the beginning practitioner begins to cultivate them, and in so doing, it sort of gains some first kind of levels of understanding of the Four Noble Truths, and then, continues to practice them and refine them, and so they can still, and they are still practiced even by Aryas. At any rate, it says, in order to, so it says, those four closely placed recollections are mentioned first. It means they're mentioned or taught first in order to bring the practitioner to an understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And then this is the key. So it's saying at the very beginning, the value of studying the Four Noble Truths is that it will bring you to a state where you develop properly aversion for samsara. Right? Aversion for samsara is, does it say here, gyoa? Korola gyoa. Okay, so that's the word. Gyoa is, I've probably said this before, but anyway, I'm mentioning it again. Gyoa, usually in colloquial Tibetan, gyoa means kind of sad, or it was gyobo means, sem gyobo means this kind of sad mind. But this word in this context doesn't mean sadness. It means some kind of very strong alarm even. So sense of great apprehension that comes with the understanding that samsara is in fact a flawed state, and one, it has various dimensions to it, as an understanding not only that samsara is not a desirable state of existence, but also that we are such that it's not easy for us to free ourselves from that samsara condition. And so both of those qualities, both of those kind of recognitions should bring about a sense of alarm and strong and dissatisfaction. And so I use the word here, aversion for samsara conditions. So that's gyoa. And the interesting thing is that, so Minjungi Samba, right? Minjungi Samba, which is one of the three principal realizations or knowledges for Buddhist practitioners, is usually described as renunciation, when in fact the word literally means deliverance. It means deliverance in the sense of, it's a synonym for nirvana, but it's a what do you call it? It's a literary device where you refer to the cause by the name of the result. Right? So I think it's called synecdoche, to use a technical literary term. And it means that a renunciation literally means the desire to achieve deliverance rather than deliverance itself. So that's literally what renunciation means. And so properly understood, it's not enough to develop what we call renunciation to have aversion for samsara. You also have to recognize the possibility of nirvana, that there is such a thing as nirvana, and that you recognize it, and that you believe, in fact, that it exists, number one. And number two, that it's possible for you to pursue it by cultivating the path, and in fact attain it. And then with that understanding, then when you develop the aspiration to seek nirvana, that is a renunciation and not before. So renunciation is actually an aspiration for nirvana, which is triggered by and is related to, but not limited to, an aversion for samsaric existence. So it's not enough to be dissatisfied with samsara. You have to also recognize the possibility of remedying that condition and then having the developing the aspiration to pursue it. And that aspiration to pursue it requires a certain kind of faith. And that kind of faith is the faith that believes there is such a thing as nirvana, and that it's possible for you to achieve it. And with that faith, then comes should come the thought. Well, therefore, I want to pursue it. So that's an important thing to understand about the subjects that are implicit in these 4 chapters. So I read this for that purpose, and as kind of introduction to the subject of the truth of suffering, or the suffering that's addressed in the 2nd chapter, and to bring up the point that the way in which to practice that relates to the Four Noble Truths is initially to cultivate these 4 so-called closely placed recollections. I don't want to address it. There are people who don't like to use the word recollection for what is the Sanskrit word smrti. Smrti in Sanskrit is a noun which comes from a verb which means to recall or to remember. I find it perfectly acceptable to think of it as recollection, but a lot of modern people, Buddhist Westerners especially, don't like that word and insist that it more properly should be called mindfulness. I have issues with calling it mindfulness. Mindfulness is not completely inappropriate, but I reserve the use of the word mindfulness for other kinds of practices, and I don't want to mix the two. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. So I'll be using the word closely placed recollection. So if you don't like it, lump it.
It's interesting because in Christian practice, recollection is a thing.
I think of recollection as simply bringing to mind and being mindful in a way, but it's a mindfulness that comes from recalling and this word smrti. Anyway, maybe we'll get to it, but how smrti is used as a form of practice is this is the Tibetan word is dremba. So dremba is the word in terms of Buddhist psychology. It is it has a very specific sort of quality that is assigned to it, and so the way smrti is described, its action or its function is that it holds some meaning in the mind. So in the Lamrim, for instance, they use Pabonga Rinpoche uses the example of a cup. It's just like smrti is like the hand that holds onto the cup, it's different from wisdom. Right? So wisdom is a discriminative kind of mind, and in fact, if you read, I have a pretty extensive section on the 4 recollections in this book, so I don't want to kind of spend too much time talking about it here. But in fact, I think it is a Sangha in the Sharvaka Bhumi. He says that the practice of the closely placed recollections involves both of those qualities, Jemba, and Shira. So, but one point is that you cannot recall. So, one of the category, the section, or the way of classifying mental states is that recollection is a type of very basic cognitive state, of which there are 5 members that have specific objects. In other words, and the point that's made is you cannot have recollection unless you're familiar with it. So you have to know, you have to have sort of, I mean, it sounds kind of trivial, but in fact, what it really means is you cannot practice, say, the 4 Noble Truths without first having some sort of understanding and some learning, some awareness of what the subject means. And then Jamba, the function of recollection, is to keep it sort of in the forefront of your awareness. So that's kind of the role that it plays. At any rate, so there are 4. The recollections are related to the 5 skandhas. So, for instance, the Noble Truth of Suffering is described as the 5 skandhas, the 5 impure skandhas, the 5 samsaric skandhas, recognized from the perspective of being a result. Right? So in the sense that the 5 skandhas that are produced by karma and mental afflictions, those 5 skandhas in that aspect represent the Noble Truth of Suffering. So we ourselves embody the Noble Truth of Suffering. So the way in which to practice the 4 recollections in relation to our own impure samsaric, and by the way, it's not limited to our own, but that's kind of the main focus of it, is the body is the first one, Lu Jambanyasha, right? Kaya means the physical body, which is the first skandha. And the second one is Sorwa and Jambanyasha is in the mental factor of feeling, right? Which is pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings.
Sorry.
Thank you so much. Is that for me?
Yes.
Oh, you're so kind. You're too kind.
Your wife told me what you like. I hope I got it right. I didn't put cinnamon though.
Oh, no. That's
like
just
that.
right. Thank you so much.
It's great.
Okay. So the second one is feelings, recollection of feelings. The third one is recollection of the mind, right? And that's actually the last skandha, number Shiva. And then the fourth skandha, the fourth recollection is, the category is called dharmas. And the dharmas in this context represents mainly the mental factors in the fourth skandha. So in particular, those mental factors, those semjung in the fourth skandha that are either virtuous or non-virtuous, those which are mental afflictions, and those which are correct ways of understanding. So those are the 4 categories. And so then Asanga describes them in a number of ways. He describes them, firstly, as having been taught as antidotes for the 4 mistaken views, the 4 mistaken beliefs about pleasure, permanence, and purity, and self, not necessarily in that order. So in the Shavaka Asanga mainly describes the first recollection, the recollection of the body, meaning the practice that you do in which you are meditating on your body, is to overcome the idea of the body as being something clean, literally, or pure, or something to be attached to. And so that's Mitsang, right? So Mitsang, then that comes in the 3rd chapter. So we don't need to talk about that here. The second recollection of Tsorwa then Asanga says, focusing on the nature of your feelings, your mental and experiential qualities, is an antidote for the idea that there's any kind of genuinely pleasurable elements to samsara. So that would be, normally you would think that that's the topic that would be addressed in the second chapter of Ayadeva's text. And to a certain extent it is. But let me just finish this. So that saying that the Torah Dhamma meditating on that counteracts right? Thinking of what is suffering, mistakenly thinking of it as some form of genuine pleasure or happiness. Okay, then the third one is Semdharma Nirshak. Semdharma Nirshak is meditating on the mind, is meant to be an antidote for that kind of stuff. I think he says here selflessness. Okay. Let me see. I'm a little bit confused. There's two ways to explain it. So let's see. Right. Oh yeah. Closely placed recollection of the mind was formulated. Oh yeah, the impermanence. Yeah. Closely placed recollection of the mind was formulated as an antidote for the error that regards what is impermanent as permanent. Okay, this is Asanga, right? So that would correspond to the way in which Aryadeva talked about subtle impermanence in relation to mental entities, right? He says, when the practitioner recognizes within the different states of his or her mind, such as those that are associated with desire, so that means all the different mental states, that all those states which occur during the day and night are so numerous, so varied and diverse, because they disappear with each passing instant, moment, and brief period, then the error that regards what is impermanent as permanent is abandoned. Okay, so that's Asanga's description of how that practice is an antidote to the mistaken or erroneous belief in permanence. Then the last one is, he says, Dhamma, right? So the last one is the recollection of entities. So how does that represent an antidote to belief in a real self? Well, the entities include, firstly, the root mental affliction in which you believe in a real self. That's one of the 5 views, right? Jikta, in short Tibetan is called Jikta. So then the antidote to that would be a form of wisdom, right? Right? So then that shira also is one of the chur in the 4th category. So then recognizing the belief in a real self as a form of mental affliction, and learning how one can counteract that or develop the proper understanding which sees that mental affliction is mistaken, and replace that with the notion of Dhamma. That's something that is developed by becoming more familiar with your mind, with all the different aspects of your mental factors. And so as you become more knowledgeable about them, to what extent they are virtuous, to what extent they're non-virtuous, then that form of reflection will culminate in or lead to developing then the antidote to belief, mistaken, erroneous belief in a self, right? So he says, closely placed recollection of entities was formulated as an antidote for the error that regards what is not a self as constituting a self, right? So the 5 skandhas do not constitute a self, a real self. nor are they related to a real self. And so then you can assess. So the practitioner sees a self, a sees meaning mistakenly sees, in relation to the heaps, the skandhas, because of the presence of such afflicted entities, as afflicted entity means any one of the mental affliction, as the mistaken view that believes in a real self, and the absence of such. And so by not having generated or developed or gained such virtuous entities as the correct view that recognizes there's no real self. So it means that these entities are the determining factor for whether you mistakenly believe in a real self or develop the awareness in which you achieve or attain the antidote for that mistaken belief. So therefore, when he or she considers entities, right, these entities, meaning the elements of the fourth skandha, in relation to their general and unique attributes, right, that is the karasa, tseni, right, then those are rangzen and jitsen, rangitsenin and chi-tsenin. So rangitsenin would be comparable to, so it's literally, the word is swalakshana. So in Madhyamika, swalakshana, it means like an essence. But here, it means that in the Abhidharma sense, swalakshana means what is the unique defining attribute of each of the various mental factors. And what are their general attributes? What are their general characteristics? Then that they are impermanent, right? That they are suffering and so on. So then it says, when you begin to you develop an understanding of those general and specific attributes and perceives those entities as they truly are, then the error that regards what is not a self as constituting a self is abandoned. Okay, so this is quotation from Asanga's Shravaka Bhumi, where he describes how the four recollections serve as, practicing the four recollections, closely placed recollections, serve as antidotes for those erroneous beliefs, right? Those four erroneous beliefs. That's one formulation. And so I talk a lot about that in this book. Now, here is something that seems to be a kind of a different take on the four closely placed recollections. So this is from the Madhyanta Vibhaga, 4th chapter, 1st verse. Do you have that?
Yes.
Okay, so it says, Nengen lencher segucher, ji chirdang mamongcher, nembashila jukawe, nembanyo shapagom, right? So this, so it says, meditation on this third line, meditation on the closely placed recollections, right, is, again, for the purpose of bringing or to bring an understanding of the Four Noble Truths. So here's, that part is the same as what Asanga is saying, generally, right? But the beginning part is what are the elements of those four recollections, and what is the essence of those